Good evening and thanks for joining us. We know the pandemic has been a massive economic shock. Now we have a snapshot of just how massive. It's the worst picture since the end of the Second World War. The federal deficit is now projected to be $343 billion. Compare that to last fall before the pandemic. The projected deficit then was just $34 billion. And the national debt is expected to exceed $1 trillion for the first time in Canadian history. About a third of the workforce is without jobs. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, though, says Canada is in a strong position to bounce back.
As a federal government, given the historically low interest rates and the low debt servicing costs that we have, and given our extremely strong fiscal position going in, we decided to take on that debt to prevent Canadians from having to do it.
Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, has looked through the numbers of this fiscal snapshot. David, what's the bottom line here?
Well, Donna, there's no sugarcoating this. The deficit this year is going to be ginormous, 10 times the size of last year's deficit, a tidal wave of red ink.
When you look at the scale of our support, it's 14% of our GDP, a very significant response that we know is going to help us to get through this particularly challenging time.
Finance Minister Bill Morneau says the deficit this year will be just over $343 billion. That's 10 times bigger than last year's deficit of $34.4 billion. In relative terms, the deficit will clock in this year at nearly 16% of the size of Canada's economy versus just 1.5% last year.
Canada enjoys an extraordinarily good credit rating, and the demand for Canadian securities for government debt remains very strong. So I don't think we're really looking at that in terms of it being a crisis or a signal that we're in really dire straits.
The economy will likely shrink this year by about 7%, but a dark warning: if a second wave of COVID-19 comes back and forces more lockdowns, the economy could shrink by 14%, and that would be about as bad as the worst year in the Great Depression, 1930, when the economy shrank by 15%. Looking ahead, the government is signaling some changes are coming to the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. But other than that, the document is silent on the future past this year. No path to a balanced budget. No word if key government services will be cut, enhanced, or modified. And there are no changes to tax rates, up or down.
We can give the government a pat on the back for what they've done, but we're not there yet, and there's a lot more to come.
Now, one quirk of the times, with interest rates so low, the federal government will actually pay less this year on interest charges than last year. And think about that. With the debt hitting $1 trillion, the federal government will actually pay $4 billion less in interest. Donna?
Thank goodness for low interest rates. David Akin in Ottawa, thanks. Let's go to our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stephenson. Mercedes, this is a snapshot, not a full picture. The opposition parties wanted more. What do they say is missing from it?
Well, Donna, the Conservatives and the NDP come at this from very different angles, as you can imagine. But here's a place where they have common ground on what's missing from this fiscal snapshot. Opposition parties are saying there is no plan for how the government will continue to support Canadian households and businesses as this pandemic stretches on, and that it does not lay out a roadmap to recovery or any specifics on how the government will pay for the billions of dollars they've already spent and how many are going to be spent going forward. The Conservatives want more money for businesses. The NDP say not enough is being done to help vulnerable Canadians. Here's some of what Andrew Scheer and Jagmeet Singh had to say today.
For the first time ever, this year, the net federal debt will reach over $1 trillion. In fact, they're borrowing so much money, Mr. Speaker, that the Bank of Canada has to create it out of thin air.
So we asked the government to put in place a wealth tax on those who have fortunes of over $20 million. Let's ask the wealthiest to bear the brunt of the pandemic.
Mercedes, budgets and fiscal updates are always political documents as much as financial ones. What are some of this government's political calculations right now?
Well, Donna, there's two separate calculations the government has to make. On the one hand, maintaining power in Parliament. They're a minority government, so they have to find ways to keep opposition parties happy. So far, they've been leaning towards the left and more spending there. But they also have to make Canadians feel that they have their back and will support them if they want to win the next election. Donna?
All right, Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa, thank you.